course starts with Module 1, which is an introductory module where some core concepts are discussed. Economics is about how societies cope with scarcity in the face of unlimited demand on resources. And economists have unique ways of viewing these issues. And so we're going to spend a bit of time on trying to establish what it means to think like an economist. And we'll see that one of the central ideas is that human beings make rational choices about resource allocation. And this, of course, applies equally to business. But of course, we have to really clarify what we mean by resources and what we mean by rationality, and what the term allocation means as well. And we'll find that there are different allocation systems in most economies. If you look at this spectrum below the blue line here, on the left-hand side, we have economies that are planned through government edict or through central planning processes, dictatorships if you like, whereas on the right-hand side, market-based economies rely very heavily on the market system where prices allocate resources. In practice, of course, economies generally operate somewhere in between, some more to the left, some more to the right. Australia is in the middle somewhere in that some decisions are made via markets, whereas some are made through government. Module 2 is about supply and demand, and it starts by asking what a market is. Well, a market is any arrangement, it doesn't have to be a physical place, but any arrangement where prices are set through the forces of demand and supply. So the first thing we need to know is what are the determinants of demand and what are the determinants of supply, and then we bring them together to show how a market price is set, and then probably more importantly, we are able to see how disturbing the demand and supply, we're able to show how prices change through market forces. Prices act as a signal for resource allocation. Unlike our original discussion about a command economy, in a market economy, it's the prices that act to help resources allocate. We then move on to discussing what economists call elasticity, and we look at how responsive markets are to changes in the variables that shift these demand curves. These are things like incomes and other prices, but also how responsive the market is to changes in prices. And finally, in this section, we look at the efficiency conclusions that economists make about markets. And particularly, this is aimed at trying to answer the question, why does everyone seem to think that competition is what society should strive for? The next module considers costs, revenues, and profits. And we start the module by asking about the difference in the definitions of costs and profits espoused by economists as opposed to accountants. And we find that opportunity cost is central to the economist definition, and this has some important implications for resource allocation. We also look at the issue of what motivates businesses, because there are obviously a whole bunch of things that could motivate businesses, like profits or revenues or sales or costs, minimizing costs, for instance. So we look at that issue. And we also analyze why it is that resource productivity is so central for economists when determining the cost of inputs. So, for instance, we are able to draw some conclusions about why it is that when workers are very productive, costs per unit of output obviously are lower. All of this analysis is done in either the short run or the long run. The short run is a situation where a business's resources are limited. It has a given factory space, it has a given number of machines, and so on, and possibly a relatively fixed labor force, and that we call the short run. In the long run, it's a situation where those constraints are no longer there. For instance, factories, firms can have longer production runs, and so on, and so they are able to enjoy economies of scale, and that has a very significant or creates a significant difference from a cost perspective. The next two modules look at business decisions in a market context. The first is where a business runs or operates within highly competitive market structures. Highly competitive markets imply that businesses have to accept the price the market sets. And this has implications for production and resource allocation, as well as the revenues and profits that firms earn. But here again, the implications are different depending on whether we're looking at the short run, and you remember the short run situation where a business's assets are relatively fixed, as compared to a long run situation where there is much more chance to change the scale of operations. And we will see that we are able to make some conclusions about the factors that help purely competitive businesses survive. In Module 5, we look at imperfectly competitive markets. These are markets where businesses hold differing degrees of monopoly power. And we analyze the factors that underlie that monopoly power, such as barriers to entry and product differentiation. We then go on to look at some models of businesses in different forms of imperfectly competitive market. For instance, we first analyze monopolies, and these are situations where there's only a single firm that monopolizes the market. We then move on to monopolistically competitive firms. These are firms where there is a fair amount of competition, but where the firm still enjoys some monopoly power. And finally, we look at models of oligopoly, where firms dominate, a few very large firms dominate the market, like the banks do, or like Coles and Woolworths dominate the supermarket market. And we end up the module by asking about the efficiency conclusions that we can make about imperfectly competitive behavior. What aspects are desirable from a societal point of view, and what are undesirable. So far, we have not mentioned the government much in our analysis, and in this penultimate module, we take a look at that issue. On the microeconomic side, governments may act directly or interfere directly with market outcomes. For instance, through the imposition of price ceilings, or price controls, sales taxes, subsidies, and that sort of thing. We look at the implications of that, but they also, in a sense, interfere in markets through regulation. In other words, they, through laws, will prevent firms from becoming too monopolized, or industries from becoming too monopolized, and they'll also prevent cartel development, and in other words, any action which is seen as making for less competition. And finally, in the microeconomic sphere, we recognize that there are a whole bunch of goods and services that are not suited for private sector provision, and the public sector becomes the provider of such services. The final part of this module, we look at market externalities. This is situations where, like pollution and that sort of thing, which have resource allocation implications and often require government to try and moderate the impact of these externalities, or in fact, in some cases where there are positive externalities, where the government is seen as having the opportunity to stimulate the production of goods and services through subsidies and that sort of thing. Macroeconomics is the focus of the final module in the course. We start out that module by looking at various measures of macroeconomic activity. And we sequentially go through and look at what we mean by real and nominal GDP and aggregate spending in the economy. And we then move on to discuss unemployment, inflation, the balance of payments. GDP, or real GDP, tends to move in business cycles, in other words, alternating periods of recessions and booms, and we take a look at what we mean by business cycles and contrast that to what we mean by economic growth, which is a longer-term growth of the economy. And we then move on to giving a brief description of what causes these business cycles and alternating periods of unemployment and inflation, before finally looking at the role of fiscal and monetary policy in managing the economy.